Hello, friends. Today on this Ash Wednesday of the year of our Lord 2025, I am joined by another friend, Len. Uh, we're going to talk about Ash Wednesday and Lent, and what that means, and why we do it, and some Protestant objections we have to it. How are you today, Len?
Oh, I'm doing good.
Good, good. Well,
Very
welcome to the show, and we're going to jump right in. So I figured we'd start with just talking about
great to be here.
yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think we can start. We're just going to have some back and forth just discussion about what Lent is and why we do it. And this is a season that in my upbringing at least we had a lot of Protestant objections to. And ostensibly those Protestant objections seem legitimate. I mean, I understand why they'd want to object to it. So in particular, Matthew 6:16. I believe this verse shows up a couple times in the synoptics. But we're gonna use Matthew's version. It really doesn't matter which one you want to use. Um, Jesus says, and this is on the Sermon on the Mount, and when you fast, do not look. Oh, I'm going to share the screen here, actually. Here. Let me know when you can see my screen.
All right. And yeah, I can see it now.
Great. All right, right here. We're going to read this passage right here. And when you fast, do not look dismal like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that fasting may not be seen by men, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. I mean, I think, Len, you could probably see why, us doing public fasting, everyone can see the ashes on our head, and um, if
Yeah.
you after the service, I think you and I, neither of us have been to the service yet, but after service, we'll have ashes on our head for the rest of the day, and everyone can see we're fasting. Anyone that knows us knows we're abstaining from meat on Fridays in Lent, and as well as Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, and on top of that, Ash Wednesday, Good Friday, we fast. A small fast, but a fast nonetheless. It's like, oh, it's public. Everyone knows that. Or we tell people how to fast because doesn't this violate Jesus' command? Yeah, I guess. What are your thoughts on that when you see that at first? Would you think that ostensibly looks like a challenge for a Protestant, a good challenge?
Um, yeah, it definitely on the face of it um makes one pause, and I think even most Catholics during Mass when this reading comes up on a lot of Ash Wednesdays start thinking about that, like, wait a minute. And then if the priest doesn't give a homily explaining that, they can go away kind of puzzled.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. So I think a really good answer that I never really thought of before, my journey home to the Catholic Church is, when you look at the same chapter, and again, this comes up, I think, in other synoptic gospels, but just a few verses up, Jesus says something very similar. And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in synagogues and at street corners that they may be seen by men. Truly, I say to you, they have their reward. When you uh, go into your room. When you pray, go into your room and shut the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So when you go a couple verses up, he says the same thing about prayer. And yet, when we look at Protestant services, if you've ever been to a Protestant service, if you haven't, I'll tell you, they pray publicly. In fact, you go to a
Yeah,
Protestant's
it's a
house for
very
yeah, go ahead, go
it's
ahead.
very communal. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
and
very a communal prayer.
that's not a bad thing. We do the same thing. We're praying church together around the dinner table. We pray together. The nightly prayer before bed with the kids. Whatever. We all pray in group settings, Bible study before we read or after. Whatever. We have prayer meetings. And Protestants are no stranger to prayer meetings. They're no stranger to praying in public before
Yeah.
dinner, before bed. It's just they do the same thing, and yet aren't they violating Jesus' command right here? When you pray, it's in secret. Do it in secret. Don't do it public. Well,
Yeah.
obviously,
And I
there's
think that
there's yeah. Go on, go on. Yeah,
that passage, yeah, that passage just sort of unlocked the key to it all, and it's it's really about. I mean, you just have to look at the Pharisee in there. That's that's doing it publicly, and he's doing it in a hypocritical way, and he's doing it to showboat and things like
Right.
that. So that's kind of the key takeaway. So even when regards to fasting, we're not doing it to showboat, to say, hey, look at me, I'm really holy and blah blah blah. It's really done kind of in the opposite. It's the opposite of saying that I'm holy. It's saying that it's saying that I'm a sinner and that I'm mortal, and that and then any public aspect of it that we do is gonna have a kind of a call to sort of invite others to either question it, or to not question, like interrogate, but to draw interest, for them to say, hey, what's going on here? That's kind of interesting. Um, or to invite them to join us. So
Right, exactly. And the idea that we shouldn't pray in secret. It's really the same. I mean, it really goes back. It's the same as it's the same with fasting. There's public and there's private fasting. There's public and there's private prayer. And I want to point out too, when we look at scripture, we actually see in the Old Testament that there were commands. If you look at Joel 2:15, I'm just going to go through a couple verses I have here. Just look up the word solemn assembly in your Bible, and you'll find there were commands to solemn assemblies in the Levitical law, or the Mosaic law, I mean to say, and there are also commands to solemn assemblies throughout the Bible, like such as in Joel chapter 2. They would call for public fasts. Joel chapter 2, blow the trumpet. Well, isn't that what Jesus just said not to do? Sanctify a fast, call a solemn assembly. There's trumpets involved. There's a public fast involved. It's a public prayer
yeah,
and fasting. Like, whoa, this is a huge violation. Well, no, like you said, it's the hypocrite is the key to the passage here. We're not doing this for public honors. We're not doing this to get attention. We're doing this uh, as a communal act of repentance, as a communal act of penance and prayer as a group, just like Protestants do on their services when they pray together as a group. So
it's
yeah,
really the intention.
yeah, the heart behind it. God cares about and sees the heart. It's which I think
Yeah,
Protestants know that usually, but it just I think seeing it in Scripture, it's not just that we have a good heart, but we're doing it wrong. It's like no, the Bible actually has this in scripture. Some might say, well, that's Old Testament, but yeah, but Jesus didn't have the New Testament at the time he was teaching this. He was in the context of people who were supposed to be obeying the law. And in that context, he was condemning people who were hypocrites, but he wasn't condemning
yeah,
people that weren't hypocrites doing this. He was specifically condemning a group of people who were doing this hypocritically. Think of Esther had the ash and dung on her forehead. You think of and
right.
Mordecai as well did the same thing. And
Actually, it's funny. It's funny. It's like, boy, I'm really glad that God in the New Testament didn't decide to keep the dung part of that tradition.
yes, yes, indeed, yes, indeed. Yeah, so
I think Christianity would be a lot less popular had
the
that been the
church and her
case.
the church and her her divinely guided wisdom has opted to not do dung for Ash Wednesday as part of our penance.
Yeah,
But
if the church ever wants to purge all of the, like, the lukewarm Christians, we'll just reinstate the dung aspect of that. We'll see who's really who's
I
really
was
real at that point.
I was reading Ezekiel in a Bible study with a group of guys not too long ago, and we were reading about how God commands him uh to cook his food on human dung. And
Oh,
uh and Ezekiel says, but God, I don't want to violate the law and eat something unclean that would make me, ritually unclean according to the law. So can we modify what I'm cooking the food on? I said to the guys, I'm like, I'm sure that was just piety. That was the only reason he didn't want to do that. Just piety kept him from that. There's no other motivations there for that pious request not to be unclean or eat unclean food.
yeah.
But um but yeah, I mean, God, God graciously. gracefully or mercifully does give him an alternative in that verse, and the church does the same for us. We just use ashes today.
Hey,
So
actually, go back to that Matthew, that first
yeah,
verse that you had,
yeah. Let me pull up my share screen again.
because there was another sort of aspect of that that I think is pretty interesting to talk about.
Let me know when you see my screen.
Um, okay, yeah, I do see your screen now. Let's see here. Okay, um, and so what's also interesting, I've had in my experience, like I have family members who are Protestant, and I remember they would start off by saying, or they would kind of just be really, um, kind of against just the idea of fasting. But in this passage, it's pretty interesting that Jesus doesn't say if you fast, he says when you fast. Like this is actually, and,
Right.
and it's kind of important for us as Catholics too, because a lot of Catholics don't fast, or there's not a whole lot of Catholics that do real fasting, or even outside of Lent. I mean, like fasting is just right up there with prayer. Like
Hmm.
it's kind of a type of prayer, but it's one that we just don't really in today's world we just don't really um utilize that form of prayer of fasting. But Jesus is
Yeah.
clearly telling us, and when you fast, God expects you to fast. Like he's
Right.
expecting it. It's when you fast. And then um uh let's see, what was I about to say? Yeah, I can't remember now. Well, but
No, that's all right. That's
but
a
yeah,
good
like
point. It's not when you it's not if you fast, it's when you fast. There is an expectation. And that's not just Catholics. And a lot of Protestants don't fast either. That kind of happens in all groups of Christianity. People
yeah, I mean, like with Protestants, like some Protestants, it's almost like it's almost they're almost like vehemently against it for some reason. But it's like clearly right there in Scripture that fasting is part of what God expects us to do. It's part of prayer.
well, especially under
In
the
today's
oh,
oh, go
sorry.
ahead.
Especially in like the more prosperity gospel type groups, and that would be where I'd see an aversion to it, where they say that Christ has already suffered for us, so we don't have to do any suffering, and that's completely contrary to the gospel, because we see in the gospel that we're supposed to be
Right,
fasting, we're supposed to be praying, we're going to be suffering. Christ is our model. He had to go for the 40 days of the desert, and we had to go through our 40 days of Lent. There's a voluntary prayer and fasting that are both public and private, that is part of the Christian life. And some of it's involuntary too. Christ, had to go through sufferings that he didn't. I mean, he opted for it all by virtue of just his choosing to come to Earth and the incarnation and whatnot. But if it's in your will to allow it, he says, let this cup pass from me. It wasn't like he always wanted the worst possible suffering he could possibly do.
yeah,
If there's any way to do this easier, he's saying that, can we do that, please, God? If there's a better way, but we don't always choose the sufferings we have in this life the way they come to us, but we can offer those up too. And that just goes along with Romans 12. It says we present ourselves to God as a living sacrifice. We're presenting our whole bodies to Him as living sacrifice, and whether that's through fasting and prayer, almsgiving, or charity, or offering up the sufferings that come to us involuntarily, all that we submit ourselves to the divine will, allow God to do whatever He wants to us, as far as the course He chooses for our lives to take for us. So yeah, that doesn't mean we're
yeah.
we're
I think
completely
it's
passive agents,
it's
but
pretty interesting you mentioned the prosperity gospel and suffering, because I feel like that's kind of a big part of it too. Also real quick, I was going to mention that or what I was thinking about earlier that I blanked on was that we kind of do the opposite of fasting. We're just like constantly we're more indulging.
oh yeah,
We're doing the opposite of fasting. It's just complete. We're not just at the meeting line. We're like way above it, and so I think that helps in create this culture of like fasting. Why would I do that? That's like like people can't really fathom even going down to like a subsistence level, let
yeah,
alone going below it. And I think that goes into what you're talking about, like with it, that you see this more in like the prosperity. things, and I think it's really related to suffering because a lot of Protestantism, or especially like the sort of the evangelical prosperity and that branch of it, doesn't like they have kind of an aversion to suffering in general. Like they have a different view of suffering. They don't have like the view that Catholics have regarding suffering.
Yeah. I don't want to accuse Protestants of not having at all like a blanket statement of no Protestants having developed theology on suffering, but my experience with Protestantism was that there was not a developed theology on suffering. We had apologetics for it. We had the problem of C.S. Lewis's problem of pain. We have a richly developed apologetic for why suffering is something that God allows us to go through. Why bad things happen. Uh, but that's no problem. Protestants have that. But as far as a theology for why those bad things happen, not just that God's still real and we can trust he's still good when bad things happen, but also like what are we supposed to do for the suffering? How does that work? What does it do for us? Without the satisfaction theory of the atonement that is, I wouldn't say it's unique to the Catholic faith. It's definitely not. There are Protestants who have satisfactory atonement, but it's hard to grasp apart from that, and that is a pretty uh, it is the majority view in the Catholic Church, and it is pretty much the it is extreme minority in the Protestant community. So which is we when we do our suffering, so we offer up those prayers, works, and sufferings that we do to God as an offering, and these are works that we can actually offer up, participating in the work of Christ, and that's a Paul actually says he makes perfect what is lacking in Christ, which is a horrible sounding statement. He
Right.
makes perfect what
Yeah.
is what is that? I'll find that verse here real quick, but in a
Yeah.
second. But
I, I think
because
I'm not sure if it's a different verse or if it's that same one, but I was thinking of something very similar, like yeah, I can't remember now. But I think it's really along those lines that you just mentioned.
yeah, I want to read that verse because that's one of those verses that Protestants probably gonna be like, what do you mean that sounds like heresy? And I'll show you on uh Bible Hub so you can see different translations to Protestant translation. Yeah, here we are. I want to read it right because I don't want to misread the verse either here. So share screen. So this is just the verse in reference. We'll do the New International Version. A lot of Protestants like that one. Now I rejoice in what I am suffering for you. So he's suffering for them, not just for his own benefits. And James talks about suffering as a good thing because it does help us grow in perseverance, and that's true. James is correct in his epistle, but there's also suffering that can be done for others. I'm suffering for you, and I will fill up in my flesh what is still lacking in regard to Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, which is the church. So he is actually suffering for the sake of his body, which is the church. Yeah, so there's a level of suffering that we can do on behalf of other people, offering that up to God as a prayer, just like we fast. And that's something too, theology of fasting. Why do we fast? It's not just mortification of the flesh so we can learn to overcome our concupiscence, which is true. That is part of how we fast. Um, but it's also, and that Protestants usually understand that aspect of fasting, but that's just willpower practice. You're just training your will, which is good. That's a good thing, and that's not a bad thing. But there's also a level of I am voluntarily suffering to offer this up, to present myself as a living sacrifice. Romans 12 says, "Present yourselves as a living sacrifice." I beseech you, therefore, brethren, to present yourselves as a living sacrifice to God. He says in Romans 12. There is a actual presentation of our bodies and our prayers, works, and sufferings to God as a sacrifice. And all of Romans 12, he goes over through things that we offer up, charity and almsgiving and whatnot. So this is not a foreign concept to the biblical authors. This is a very scriptural thing that unfortunately is not talked about very often, at the very least, in Protestantism, if not undeveloped at all, or hardly developed at all. Again, I think some of the more high church traditions is probably different. I come from a more,
Yeah. Or like
mainline,
Anglicans and
yeah, evangelical type of
Lutherans.
non-denominationalism. But yeah, Lutherans and Anglicans, they might have a better theology on that. Anglicans especially, who tend to be the most biblically grounded of Protestant groups, Anglicans tend to
By
be more.
Anglicans in particular.
Yeah, yeah. She clarified that Anglicans and Episcopalians who are actually practicing the faith. Yeah, we're not talking
Yeah.
about the Susan, Mother Susan who thinks she's a priest. Yeah, we're talking about
Yeah.
cross-dressing as a priest. Not that any Anglicans are real priests anyway, but at least the men are at least the men are dressing appropriate to their gender and not cross-dressing into a man's outfit, pretending to be something they can
Yeah.
never be. But you can
I,
tell how I feel about women pastors.
right. Um, I think that uh, for me too, like what I always think about it regards to suffering is that that with Catholics especially, um like we look at the way Christ suffered on the cross, and it's not that like it's kind of the message behind it is that we're not gonna, life is gonna be suffering. There's gonna be things that you're not gonna be able to avoid some suffering in this world. It's gonna be part of life, but Jesus shows us how to suffer, and because of that, we can know how to suffer as well. And when you think about it too, like when you talked about like he turns suffering into sacrifice, and sacrifice is just kind of that. It's kind of that highest form of love, really.
Yeah, yeah. He says, "Greater love hath no man than this, than the one who lays down his life for his friends." And we are laying ourselves down for Christ when we uh, do these voluntary penances, the fasting, and it's not the same degree as actually dying, but there is a sense of mortification of the flesh, which Protestants do recognize that concept, but at least a lot of them do. But but it's a sort of death to self in that we are giving up what we want and giving to God what He wants, which may be almsgiving, it may be just prayer, but it's an act of giving up something and giving something at the same time, and that's the important thing too. Because if it's just giving up something, you're just practicing your will at that point, and that's not a bad thing to have a stronger will. Just like it's not a bad thing to go to the gym and work out and be a stronger person.
Yeah.
But if you're just doing it for that, it's not spiritually beneficial. But when you're giving up something to give something to God, and as a gift to God, that's a different thing. And we can give up things as a gift to God, and that's part of it too. Offering up that suffering to God is part of the prayer.
And, this might be changing the subject just a little bit, but
For
you
sure.
mentioned like you're giving something up for God. Um, have you ever run across people like even Catholics that they when they talk about things that they're giving up for Lent, and they just give up something that's
Yes.
very inconsequential or um
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, go on. I'm sorry. I'm going to cut you off. Go on.
oh well I was for me, I was gonna connect it to kind of like the Old Testament with like I think it's Cain and Abel, like their what they what they um like their offerings to God, and why one was accepted and the other wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Because I have a couple thoughts on that passage, why one was accepted, the other wasn't. But I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Well, it's been a little bit since I've looked over that passage, but for from what I remember, is that one of them wasn't uh it was like not the it wasn't like the best of what he had that he gave up,
Yeah, it's a
whereas the other
theory. I
one.
I don't know if it says that or not. I don't think it does, but it might clarify that somewhere. But as far as I recall, it doesn't. I've heard a number of different interpretations. I think they're good too. I don't think that the interpretations are all bad. I think the primary reason that I see in that is just that it is a blood offering versus a grain offering, and the Hebrew says that you need the sacrifice, the shedding of blood for the forgiveness of sins. So it's you know, grain offerings are good, but there's a primacy to blood offerings, and even prior to there being a law, God was establishing this concept. But I've heard other interpretations as well. I think not all bad either. I've heard some bad ones, but I've heard not all bad ones. Yeah, there a
There's a
lot of
lot of other passages too that kind of hit that similar thing where people give uh you know give something that's inconsequential
Yeah.
versus like the
But that's a good
like
point
the
though.
one where someone
In
gives like a poor person gives like 10 cents or whatever it was, but that was actually literally all they had
right.
versus the rich person that gave like a whole lot more, but it's just not you know not that very much to them.
Yeah, that's like the widow's mite. She gives up. She doesn't give a tithe. She gives everything, and
Yeah.
the minimum was a tithe. So you may have these rich people that aren't even giving the minimum, and what does that mean? Like, well, is it good? Maybe it's good, but they're not even living up to the law that God gave them, which is a tenth. If they're rich, they can afford it. So it might be a good thing, on the scale of things, but it's definitely not good enough for what God commanded them. And she's giving way more than what God commanded by virtue of giving everything, even if it was a smaller amount. So yeah, it's definitely something, someone to model as that widow who gave everything. But and I don't know if I'd use the example of Cain or not in that context. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we have evidence that what he gave was somehow violating God's command or not good enough, but it was just God rejected it. We don't know exactly why, except perhaps in the context of later theology. But what I would give a context of is I'm drawing a blank on their names, Aaron's sons, who offer up strange fire to God. So after the Mosaic law was instituted, Aaron's sons offer up strange fire to God. God had instituted a very particular kind of worship, and He said, "This is how I want to be worshipped." And they did it different. They wanted to do it their own way, and that would be an example of less than what God has. If I might say that, hey, I know the church says to give up meat on Fridays and to only have uh, two small meals and one full meal. Okay, that's a good thing, and but maybe I just want to do. I'm going to give up. Vegetables instead because I'm a vegetarian. I think that'd be a good thing to do. Give up vegetables instead, and I'm going to have a lot of meals because I'm going to give more alms today. Say, well, the bare minimum was this. It's not. You can substitute that.
Yeah.
It's not. You can't substitute that for other things. Now, there are some fasting periods or people who have disabilities. I actually do have my own disability. I can't do the full Lenten fast, unfortunately. But my priest gives me I can get an alternative. But in that case, I'm getting a dispensation that's actually from someone higher than me. I'm not just absolving myself of
Yeah.
the responsibility.
Yeah.
Um, and
You're not
and
going rogue.
yeah, I'm not going rogue on that. And we're not supposed to just go and do our own thing. It's the bare minimum. And so we do that.
You could
If
always
we
add to that. Like,
You can
yeah,
always add to it. Yes.
yeah, it's you don't just replace it or do something that opposes it. Like you said,
Right.
like doing more of that because I'm going to do something else. But you can do, you can if you're a vegetarian, you're abstaining from meat anyway, so it's not a big deal to continue to abstain from meat.
Right.
But just keep that and then add to it, add your own thing.
My point was, like, if you want to do more than that, but you're not doing the bare minimum, then you're like the people who weren't giving a tenth. They might have been doing a lot of great things, but they're not even giving the
Yeah,
tenth they're supposed to. They gave maybe more than a widow by a good amount, but they're still not doing the tenth they're supposed to. And I could do,
right.
a great fast that's like this is an extraordinary fast, but I'm not actually doing the thing that they asked me to do. Yeah, it's like, well,
Yeah,
it does include meat when they told me not to do meat. Yeah, well, that's still you're not meeting the bare minimum, even though it's a big fast. It might be a good thing on a regular Friday, but it's not a good thing on Good Friday or Ash Wednesday when we're told to or Fridays and Lent we're told to just have fish or nothing, not no meat. Actually, doesn't fish is not a requirement, but you know that
that,
that's a typical
that
go-to.
kind of reminded me of like the argument about what type of worship God requires of us. So
Yes,
it reminds when you mentioned like how they brought strange offerings and um or like I think there was like a Joe Heschmeyer thing recently about not too long ago about this too, where he was talking about um like is Protestant worship really worship and
yeah,
and um and like how the liturgy and the mass is like the sort of the true worship that God is
right,
asking of us, and that these things that Protestants do when in their worship services are all good, but it's not like that exact thing that God is asking us to do that we do it
right,
that Catholics and even Orthodox do in Mass or in the liturgy.
yeah. And that's exactly right. There's nothing wrong with the Protestant service. Having a hour of praise music and an hour of lecture afterwards that teaches in the Bible if you're teaching true doctrines and truth, and if the praise music is good and truth, not heretical music, which sometimes happens. If you're doing all things being equal, assuming that they're doing good and honest praise music, that's good theology, it's rooted in good theology, and good and honest teaching is rooted in good theology. There's nothing wrong with the Protestant service, except that they're doing it instead of mass, which is what God's commanded them to do. The mass, or the divine liturgy,
Right.
as we call it in my rite. This is a the way God has commanded us to worship. I hear Protestants. It's funny because Protestants will read the Old Testament and they'll say, "Oh, if I had been living under the wicked King Ahab or Queen Jezebel, I still would have done all the sacrifice that I need to, but I wouldn't have participated in the idolatry and things. Or at least that would be what they hoped to do. Maybe they're a little more honest. Because if we're being honest, it's difficult to say any of us would do the right thing if we were in Nazi Germany or if we were in Jezebelic Israel. But
Yeah.
what we would want to have done is to have done this. What they would have wanted to have done is done the sacrifices that they're supposed to do, obey the law that they're supposed to, but not participate in the idolatry of the priests and the king. And yet, when the Catholic Church, when they see priests and bishops who are bad, or popes who aren't the greatest popes doing bad things, they say, "Well, I wouldn't want to, you can't be under that bad leadership. Don't be under that bad leadership. You're going to spiritually bankrupt yourself by being under that bad leadership. You got to go out and become Protestant now and reject that structure and join a church that has good people at the head of it." Well, maybe they are good people. Maybe you do have a good pastor, but guess what? God didn't ordain him. He's not in apostolic succession. He's his own guy who went rogue and started the Bible and or with the Bible and
Yeah.
started his own church. And we see what happens to those people in the story of Moses. Whenever someone thinks they're better than Moses or as good a man as Moses, we have the rebellion of Korah, I think was the one rebellion where the earth opens up and swallows them in fire. You know, and if we're looking at this, like, what does that symbolize for the New Testament? Well, God established a leadership, and what happens to people who go against that leadership and try to start their own thing? What does that fire? What do you think that fire symbolizes? If the old covenant was met with a physical fire that burned these people up and swallowed them into the ground when they wouldn't submit to the leadership of Moses, what is the spirit? What does that look like spiritually? The new covenant, the people who reject the authority of God and the Church of God, go off and do their own thing because they think they're better than leadership. Um,
Right.
now, of course, one could say, well, that was a good leader, Moses. But what about the bad leadership? Well, even in the times of bad leadership, you know, Elijah and Elisha, uh, these people were still expected to obey the law and submit to the structure that they had. David was under a very bad king, Saul, and yet he would not
Yeah.
lift his hand against God's anointed. There was a structure that God had created that even if the person is bad, he's still God's anointed. Even if the Pope is bad, or even if the bishop is bad, or the priest you have is bad, like my one of my patrons, Peter Canisius, says, you would be a fool to step over a golden ring you found because it's in the mud. Pick it up and or if you're starving, and someone offers you an apple from a dirty bowl, guess what? The food, the apple is still food. Ignore the bowl, take the food, wash off the apple and eat it or whatever. But take it.
Yeah.
We're not allowed to just go off and start our own leadership. And some of the earliest church controversies in the Epistle of First Clement is all about that, where people thought they were better than the people that the apostles had ordained, and so they wanted to start their own leadership structure. And Clement has to write to them and say, no, like the ordination and succession of apostles is the proper authority, and if you don't like them, well, we can work on that, but they're still the proper and legitimate authority. But yeah,
Right.
so I don't want to ramble on too long, but yeah, that's a good point that the Protestants they step out of God's order of things, and uh, that this is one example. Actually, some of the earliest Protestants, Zwingli, famously, one of the things he did in the city that I forgot what city Zwingli is in. He was Austrian, but what city was he in? But he called for them to stop fasting on Friday, stop doing the Friday fasts, and of course
Oh,
he
wow.
didn't do it. He still ate the meat, or he still did the fast and didn't eat meat that Friday. But he told everyone, don't listen to the church. You can now eat whatever you want because this is unjust that they're telling us to, or wrong that they're telling us that we should do public fasting. And some of the first Protestants, that was one of the first things, is this sort of Lenten devotion that we do. He one of the first things they did was stand against that. And it's like,
Wow.
well, the church has the authority to call solemn assemblies and fasts and days of prayer, and this is Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, and Fridays in Lent are some of them. So yeah, I'll let you give your points. I didn't mean to ramble on too long.
Oh no, no, that's great. I pretty much finished what I was going to say about that.
Yeah, good, good. Yeah. So we have it's not that hard of a fast. It used to be more difficult in the different times, but I was looking into
Yeah,
this actually when I first came into the church. I was told that I had been told that you have to do no meat on Ash Wednesday, Good Friday, or Fridays in Lent, um, and all three of those you can only eat two small portions that don't add up to a full meal and one full meal. And I was like, okay, it's not that's not that difficult. Although I did learn it's even easier than that recently. I was reading up on that.
yeah,
Thanks to Jimmy Aiken. Shout out to Jimmy Aiken. I know you're a fan of him too. So
yeah.
he pointed out. I read his article, or a lot of he has a number of articles, but I read some of his articles on this topic. Um, the church actually only says the fasting is only required on Good Friday and Ash Wednesday. It's the only
And
days
Ash
that we have to
Wednesday.
fast, and it's not two meals that can't add to a full meal. That's actually not in the law. There's no size requirement for the two small meals, or some food. It says it just says some food twice a day, morning and evening. So
Yeah,
it does specify morning and evening. So some food in the morning, some food in the evening, and a meal, full meal. And what that looks like, use your conscience. I mean, theoretically, it could be a big meal, or it could be a small meal, and theoretically, the some food could be a lot or a little, but the spirit of it is a fast. So keep that in mind. And I think the spirit of it, the way
yeah.
it's worded, I think we can assume some food isn't a five-course meal, but what exactly it looks like is a little bit open to interpretation. um and then the Fridays in Lent, the only requirement is no meat. So it's actually
Yeah.
not even that
It's such a
difficult.
it's a very lenient, like it's so lenient. I can only imagine that gotten more lenient, in our
Yes.
time, just because people, you know are just not, don't want to do more, and so they just made it more and more lenient over the years. But like what I think of about this is like the difference between, like, say, the Ten Commandments versus the Beatitudes. And so it's like the Ten Commandments are like the guardrails, and so this what what this what these guidelines for Lent are those guardrails. They're like
Right.
the bare minimum that you shouldn't be doing.
Yes.
You shouldn't be going less than this or whatever. But the Beatitudes are above the ten. They're your attitude to go beyond that. Not
Yes.
doing just not trying to, like, it's like not trying to just avoid the fires of hell, but to really truly love God, that type of thing.
Yeah. The Ten Commandments are don't do these bad things. The Beatitudes are but do these good things.
Yeah,
So it's a both end. It's not just one or the other. And that's what Lent is all about. It's one of our several. We do have several fasting seasons in the church that are like this.
like
Lent,
Advent.
Advent, and Ember Days. Now, Ember Days, unfortunately, in most of the Latin Rite, don't exist anymore, but we do have them actually in my rite, which is I keep saying rite, but I'm actually in the Latin Rite, but in the Ordinariate, which our diocese does have, or our diocese plural do have Ember Days still. So we fast
Oh
on
wow.
on 4 times a year on Ember Days, and then during Lent, and then Advent is a voluntary fast altogether. So Advent isn't even a mandatory fast, although it is a penitential season where we're encouraged to do so. But all of this is the bare minimum, like you're saying, and the church is teaching us how to fast and how to do almsgiving. It's a pedagogical. The church is our mother, and she is uh, and mothers do pedagogy for their children. They teach their children how to be adults, and that's a responsibility and a role of mother. And she's teaching us the bare minimum. She's teaching us, okay, there's times where we're going to fast. There's times where we're going to have to do almsgiving. There's times where we're going to have to, um, you know, give up and do above and beyond what we would normally do. And this is the bare minimum. It's not that much. It's a very, very mild fast, but it's to teach us how to do more. Okay, if
Yeah.
now that you're
To
good,
invite us to do more.
now that you got the minimum down, how about you try fasting a little more than what the church says to do? Maybe go for a full day without eating on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. Maybe fast throughout the year on in secret during times that people don't know. These
Yeah.
are optional things but things that are we're encouraged to do. And really, if you're not doing those things throughout your Christian life, a Christian who doesn't fast and doesn't do almsgiving and doesn't do prayer and penance, it's hard to call them a Christian at that point.
Yeah.
Sure, you objectively had still the mark of baptism, but like you're not living the Christian life if you're not doing those things. And the church is
Right.
teaching us how to live the Christian life by making these things
Another
mandatory certain times of the year.
another aspect of this that this reminds me of, or kind of similar, is like the requirements to go to confession once a year.
Yes.
And so it's like that guardrail isn't, it's not there. So it's like, oh, okay, I can, I only need to go to, I just need to go to confession once a year, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's they
Well,
don't say you have to go any specific number beyond that, but it's kind of, that's just literally there to stop you from just being like, oh, you know what, I'm since I'm just never gonna go. Like
I've
some
talked to
people would literally do that.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I've talked to some Protestants who believe that it is possible to get to a point where you don't sin anymore. And they say that all are with sin, all have sinned. There's no one without sin. That's in the sense they have sinned, past tense, but they'll say, I don't sin anymore, or at least they'll believe it in secret. And there's actually some noteworthy names that subscribe to that theology. But I knew some people who thought like that, where they had
Wow.
convinced themselves that they got to a point where they've done enough mortification and prayer and fasting that they are above sin now. They don't do anything wrong anymore. And
That's actually interesting that that's like usually Protestants are like the opposite of that. They're usually trying to say that
it's
nobody's sinless, not even the Virgin Mary, or like,
yeah,
things like that.
well, they're not
So
saying
it's
they're
kind of
sinless in the sense
interesting.
that they've never sinned. They'll admit they've sinned, but it's all
Yeah,
past
okay.
tense. That was way back
Wow.
then. Now I've attained a spirituality that no longer sins. And I'm not perfect,
But
maybe I still make mistakes, quote unquote, but not sins. And
isn't
that
that
is
like, isn't that like, what is that? Isn't that like the sin of presumption or something like that? Like you're just
it's
presuming yourself to be sinless, and that in
I would
itself is kind of,
say it's definitely pride, definitely vanity and
yeah,
vainglory. It's definitely a lack of self-awareness, maybe even to a degree that, and
yeah,
this is the but that good. My point though is that the church is guarding against that. Yeah, you might
yeah,
think you're a really good person, but everyone needs confession at least once a year. Maybe you didn't do any mortal sins. I don't have any issue with saying that people go a full year without any mortal sins, even a full you know years without mortal sins. Yeah, that's fine, well and good. But you're doing some venial stuff. You definitely are doing some venial stuff. And
yeah,
we all fall into venial stuff, here and there. And maybe you can go a week without venial sin, maybe, but I don't think I can. But maybe some of us can. But
yeah,
but on the scale of things, you got something to confess. So
yeah,
do it at least once a year. And if you can't think of anything after the whole year, it's probably pride. It's probably like it's probably
yeah,
vainglory.
yeah.
It's
Um,
probably
all
not
right, so
praying enough and not being doing enough examinations in prayer and really being
right,
honest with yourself before God about what kind of person you are and what you do in your life. But yeah, with the
yeah. So
exception of
I
someone
have to get.
who's yeah, go on, yeah.
Oh, I was gonna say I have to get going. We're going to the Ash Wednesday Mass here in just a
Oh,
little
yep,
bit.
yeah.
But
Well,
there's one
enjoy.
other thing I did want to also mention that there's like uh I only have one example off the top of my head, but there's some funny, kind of funny things, exceptions that the Catholic churches in different parts of the world make for abstaining from meat. And so
Oh
one
yeah,
thing that Protestants always think is weird is like, why is fish, not considered meat? But there's in like Latin American uh, countries, do you know what capybaras are?
I do. Yes, and that's listen. I found out recently is you can eat that,
So yeah,
and
so
muskrat as
capybaras
well.
are not they're not considered as part of that abstaining from meat during
Right.
Lent for some reason.
Capybaras and muskrat. The reason why those two aren't considered meat is because well, fish is a different category altogether in Latin. So that's why they categorize when they say meat in Latin, meat wouldn't encompass fish. So we translate fish meat as meat, in English, but they're two different things in Latin, and that's why they're that's how they can categorize that differently. But the native many of the natives when they came to America, when the missionaries came to America, didn't quite get the concept of well, like fish are in water, capybara are in water, muskrats.
Yeah,
So why are these listed, these not? And the bishop's like, okay, give them a dispensation. It's fine if that's the only impediment to getting into the church. These laws about what we fast and how we fast are they're canon laws. They're not divine laws. So the church has the divine right to make canon laws.
yeah,
It's part of the binding and loosing, but what those laws are there's some leeway. Can't violate the moral law, but the church can say the fast is going to be now more strict or more lenient, and that can give specific they can give specific dispensations or broad dispensations, and that's the prerogative of the church that God gave in the binding and loosing. But yeah, it's funny because yeah, capybara, I'd love to try it. I'd love to try capybara. I'd love to try muskrat as well. Um, Amphibians are also allowed. Frog legs and
oh yeah,
alligator, they're also
alligators.
illicit. And I love
Yeah,
frog. I don't know if you ever had frog legs before, but frog legs are
I've had alligator, but
very
not
good.
frog legs.
Yeah, they're very tasty. If you ever get a chance, and I think
Oh
escargot would
wow.
probably be listed too. I love escargot as well. They're very yummy snacks that you don't really think of as at least I don't know what maybe you have some. I know you're from Indonesia originally, so you have or not Indonesia,
For
Philippines. I'm sorry, yeah,
Philippines.
Philippines. I have another buddy from Indonesia, or living in Indonesia, but but Philippines. You're in the Philippines. I don't know if you have any unique foods in there like that, but like some of the French unique foods like frog legs and escargot are really, really yummy. And they're weird to Americans, but
Wow.
if you ever give them a chance, it's like, man, they're glorious. I understand why they like that
Oh
stuff.
wow.
But
I'll definitely have to try the frog legs someday. I've always heard that it's like chicken,
yeah,
is what
so
I would
frog
always
leg,
hear.
my description of frog legs is like chicken, but like the best chicken you ever had. Like just the
Wow.
tastiest.
Okay.
So it's like chicken, but it's on another level. So
I'm gonna go head out to the Cajun restaurant here.
yeah, yeah. Like, is it gonna be the best food you ever had? Probably not. But is it tasty? Yeah. Escargot, is it tasty? Yeah. It's really yummy
Oh
and
wow.
worth a try. But I'll let you get going. I got to go on myself too.
Okay.
I got my own Ash Wednesday plans. So, but it was good
All right.
talking to you, Len, and we'll do
Yeah,
it
I hope
again
you have a blessed
sometime.
Lent, and yeah,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
was fun catching up.
Yes, indeed. All right, we'll talk to you soon.
All right. See ya.